A Second Chance Yahim's Perspective, a short story by Zakira Sheree. The weight of expectations. Blake, no. Yahim had always been taught to keep a firm grip on his emotions. His father had drilled it into him. Keep it professional. Don't let your personal life get in the way of your success. You can't afford distractions. Success was all that mattered, and that was a lesson he took to heart. Growing up, Yahim had watched his father rise and fall. How a moment of weakness, a personal relationship, had cost him his job and ultimately his sense of self. His mother had never been the same after that. Yahim's mother had always been the supportive type, staying home, taking care of the family, always putting her dreams aside for the sake of her children. Yahim respected her sacrifice, but as he grew older, he couldn't help but wonder if she had lost herself in the process. There was a quiet resentment in their home after his father's job loss, a coldness that even Yahim couldn't deny. He was determined not to let that happen to him. He wouldn't let anyone, especially a woman, distract him from his goals. He had to protect his future, his career, and his heart. When Layla first started at Unity as an intern, Yahim had been indifferent. She was lively and bubbly, but he had seen too many people like that. People who were eager to make a mark, but too easily distracted. He couldn't afford to get attached to someone who would likely be a flash in the pan. At first, Layla didn't catch his attention in the way he might have hoped, but as he observed her from a distance, something shifted. She was different. Her enthusiasm wasn't just a front, it was her essence. She didn't need to prove anything, and that was what intrigued him. He began to notice how Layla would tackle challenges head on, her creative solutions in meetings, her ability to keep the mood light even when things got tough. It was hard to admit, but he admired her resilience. He admired her drive. And then it hit him. He found himself wondering what it would be like to be with someone like her, to have her by his side, not just as a colleague, but as someone he could share his life with. The thought terrified him. He couldn't. No, he wouldn't let himself fall for her. He'd already seen where that road led, and it wasn't a place he wanted to go. Despite his growing feelings, Yahim kept his distance. He made sure to maintain that cool, professional exterior, the same one his father had taught him to uphold. He had to, for Layla's sake and his own sake. There was no room for distractions, so he did what he knew best. He would build walls around himself. And then came the day Layla was moved to a new department. Yahim had clapped for her, congratulated her, but that night he stayed up late, wrestling with the gnawing realization that he might have just lost his chance with her, with someone like her. But life moved on. Yahim tried to date others, but none of them felt like Layla. She haunted his thoughts, even when he didn't want her to. For years, he told himself that it was just a passing thing, that he was moving on, but truth be told, he hadn't. Layla never left his mind. She was there, always. The moment he saw her in Home Depot, it felt like fate. After all these years, they were standing face to face again. Yahim's heart dropped. He hadn't seen her in years, and now she was here, in the most unexpected of places. And then just hours later, he had found out she was the client. When he spoke to her on the phone for the first time, the connection was immediate. She was still the same Layla, the one he had admired from a distance, the one he had wanted but never let himself have. But this time, there was a difference. Yahim could feel it. He was different. He wasn't the same man who had shut himself off from the world, from her. No, now he was willing to let her in, to risk everything for a second chance. But there was still the problem of his past, his history with her, how he had been so cold, distant, and even a little rude when she had been his intern. He didn't know how to fix that, How could he possibly explain why he had kept her at arm's length for so long? He didn't want to be vulnerable, didn't want to risk her turning away. But now, as they stood on the cobblestone streets of Paris under the Eiffel Tower, he knew it was time to take the leap. When Layla looked at him in shock, confusion washing over her face as she realized the man standing before her was Blake, the same man who had been so distant. Yahim's heart raced. That was it. The moment he had been waiting for, dreading and yearning for all at once. He had to tell her the truth. They sat on the bench and Yahim felt his walls begin to crumble. There was no hiding anymore. He owed her the explanation. He owed her the truth. "Why were you always so distant?" Layla asked, her voice soft yet piercing. Yahim paused, his throat tight. How could he explain the weight of his upbringing, the lessons from his father's, the disappointment he had seen in his mother's eyes as she tried to put her dreams aside? How could he explain that he had been afraid of loving her, afraid of losing himself in her, afraid of not being enough? "I guess," Yahim began, his voice low, "I was afraid that if I let anyone in, I'd lose sight of everything I worked for. My father, he taught me to keep my emotions out of the picture, to never let anyone get in the way of my success." Layla didn't say anything, but her gaze softened. Yahim felt the warmth of her understanding. "I didn't want to stand in the way of your dreams, Layla," he continued. "You were so focused, driven. I didn't want to be the one to distract you from everything you were meant to accomplish." Layla's hand found his, and for the first time, Yahim allowed himself to be vulnerable, to feel. He squeezed her hand gently, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where this would go, but he knew one thing. It was worth it. Whatever came next, it was worth it. Under the twinkling lights of Paris, Yahim and Layla sat in silence, both of them taking in the moment. The world around them seemed to fade away. For the first time in a long time, Yahim felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be.